I'm pleased to be here and welcoming Edward Daciuk from ExtensionEngine to talk about adaptive learning. This is a full audience, so just make room for anybody who comes in a little bit late. And I just want to remind everybody that we are recording all of these, so please be mindful of, like, taking pictures and stuff. We'll have everything posted on our YouTube channel at the end of the conference. So please welcome Edward.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to hear me chat. Today, as Serena said, I'm going to be talking about adaptive integrated with edX. And the way I'm going to do that is going to take you through one of the projects that we're working on that required adaptive integration. And I'll try to talk about the specifics of the project, but also more generally about adaptive and kind of the pros and cons and what someone might want to think about before kind of diving in. So the project that we're working on, we're currently working on it, so I can't talk too much about the details, but it's in the online or corporate education space. So it's a firm, it's a top 3 ratings agency, and they're also in the business of training up bank staff and other corporations around compliance and security, discrimination and things like that. And it's a lot to worry about. So it's actually a big job, a big concern for a lot of companies, especially in the banking industry. And they're currently in that business, and they're looking at online education, and they're thinking, hey, here's an opportunity to take this online education technology and kind of advanced state-of-the-art with respect to training, better distribution, more up-to-date materials, try to drive down costs and things like that. So they came to us, ExtensionEngine, and to help them kind of build this platform. And we worked with edX and edX for a long time. We worked with them very closely. So it was a no-brainer for us on most of our projects to choose edX. The harder decision was actually using adaptive and whether or not that was appropriate for this sort of project. So I'll talk a little bit about the things that they wanted to kind of fix in doing this new project. One was, if you think about compliance training in a bank, it's like one of the most boring things ever. And it's time consuming, so those two things together means people really don't want to do it. And so it's hard managing it, it's hard tracking down, it's hard catching all the people that are, might be taking months and months to get to it. So HR and legal, they take a long time to go track these down, systems to manage it, which all has the effect of kind of driving up the cost and making everybody miserable. So they kind of wanted to fix that experience. So before I kind of get into how we built the platform and some of the trade-offs, I wanted to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page in terms of what adaptive means, because sometimes it gets confused with CBE or personalized learning and things like that. And from our perspective, when we say adaptive, obviously it's individualized paths. So think of a knowledge graph, and instead of everyone kind of taking the same linear path through that graph, people can move around individually, and you're using machine learning to kind of inform you about the individual, both their rate at going through content, how well they do in assessments, and how those two things interplay, or the types of assessments that are more conducive to that individual's learning. So you create these learning paths. It always also means dependencies, because a linear course flow doesn't really benefit from adaptive learning. There's actually no point to it. So it really requires kind of a complex knowledge graph, and we'll talk about that later, but that complexity has a huge impact on how valuable adaptive is, and it's something that we can take a look at. The other thing is content and assessment depth. So adaptive gets confused with personalized learning, whereas you read some content, you take an assessment, and then the computer tells you you're wrong, you have to go back to this content because you're weak in a particular area. Adaptive learning actually is a little bit more sophisticated than that, and uses, in our case, it was Bayesian logic that our partner uses. But basically, they're using statistical sampling and analysis to kind of get a very detailed understanding of how you learn, how you can learn faster, as well as kind of covering, making sure that you're getting the right content assessment kind of proficiency. So then the last thing, when we say adaptive, we're also talking about, it's not just an algorithm, kind of a single state where you give it the knowledge graph and then you do the tagging and then it kind of pushes you through this graph. There's this concept of that this algorithm should be able to learn from all of the learners coming through the system so that it's smarter after 10,000 students have gone through the system because it's been able to watch how people learn and what are the most efficient paths. So you get this kind of big data effect, presumably, that should improve it over time. So that's also kind of a big piece of adaptive. In terms of why would you want to do adaptive? We kind of talked about this in the beginning. Engagement is a huge issue. I took this, I won't say what course it was, but took this big data course, and it's the typical talking head, and you've got the script and you watch it and then you take an assessment and you move on, and it's just really, really boring. So the idea behind adaptive doesn't necessarily make the content more exciting, but one of the ways it kind of helps is that hopefully you're minimizing the amount of time that you're spending learning. So you're taking the most efficient path for you as an individual. You're not spending too much time on things you've already got a good grasp on, and you're spending more time on the things that you need help on. So overall, you're getting this efficiency, which reduces time, which also reduces the cost. And that's, a lot of people think of it from the student's perspective, but actually we spend a lot of time thinking about the instructor's perspective, whether or not you're creating content, but more importantly, kind of managing class. So the less time you spend teaching individuals or helping individuals through a process, the less time the instructors have to spend on these courses, which also helps kind of drive down the cost of producing these courses. And then lastly, why you might use adaptive also includes that it's that big data concept, but applied in a little bit different way. So the machine learning over time should get better, but ideally you can take that output from that big data and that machine learning and get more precise, better insights into how people are learning on your system. For instance, improving assessments so that they're more accurate and more predictive of outcomes and things like that. All right, so I'll go back to the project now. So the implementation we did, just at a very basic level, it's a custom application with a completely unique user experience and learner experience. We basically redid the workflow completely, but it is still sitting on top of edX, and we are using Studio almost out of the box. We had to make some modifications around the tree structure of the courses and things like that, and we can get into that a little bit. Then there's the corporate content integration, and then our adaptive learning partner for this project was Newton. And by the way, these guys were fantastic. If you ever thinking about working with these, they were phenomenal during this project. And that's all sitting on top of or within AWS. All right, so the steps we kind of went through to build this adaptive integration. First, we had to build a knowledge graph. And I'll talk a little bit more about the complexity of that. That's harder than it sounds because most of the content that's out there, that's existing content, and keep in mind that this is a top 3 ratings agency, so they have years and years and years of content, right, on security and compliance and all this stuff. The problem is that it's all linear. It's all case-based. It's all, in this flow. And if you say, oh, I'm going to build a graph that lets people bounce around, their years and years of content doesn't lend itself to that. So kind of cutting that up in an intelligent way, for example, in an intelligent way, so they'd have these long case studies, and they'd cover 15 topics in this one case study, and then you'd get sent to a series of questions or assessments around that case study. And so you've got to kind of go in there and pull out what are the outcomes and concepts that they're supposed to cover, and then you've got to kind of slice up the case study. And for that particular example, a lot of it was just written from scratch because it didn't make sense to go try to reuse what was there. And then the other part of it is the dependencies, and so for the adaptive learning algorithm to work, you have to feed it a lot of metadata around the content. And so for a lot of that years and years of content, that metadata does not exist. So that's an exercise that takes time and costs money actually in setting up an adaptive project. Because in addition to actually just creating the content, then you've got to go kind of step back and link everything, the content, the assessments, the outcomes, and everything else. And then you've got to kind of get that in a format that your adaptive engine can understand. And they have their own way of thinking about it. So it's not as simple as I'm just going to draw a graph and connect the dots and then hand it over to my partner. They have a way, and the way their algorithms work takes some time to kind of massage that and make those two things work together. So that's another piece of it that took some time. And that also included the assessments. So for us in corporate training, yes, there's a lot of like multiple choice questions, but there's also nowadays there's this increasing constructivist kind of mechanism where you're building Excel models or you're actually writing code or what have you. So that's really hard to turn into an adaptive model, because how do you take an Excel model and turn it into something that's modular, where you can pull it apart and say, you know, your understanding of discounted cash flow rates is not good because you had that formula in cell C5 wrong. That's kind of a difficult thing to get into the adaptive model. So it's kind of thinking through how can we kind of keep that constructivist, you know, which is highly engaging, you know, very useful type of assessment. How can we kind of keep the effect of it but make it work for this adaptive world was another issue. The mapping I talked about, and I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about that. So the issue there, or the process there, was it's not just the content and the algorithm. There's also this really awesome tool set called edX in the middle, which has its own way of kind of thinking that. So it's a little bit of a, you know, weaving something through three different things, because you've got the corporate content and the way it's structured to the extent that you've kind of been able to modularize it. And then you've got the way edX thinks of the world and its tree structure, its courses. And then you've got the adaptive learning engine, which has its way of thinking about it. And so as you're piecing together the content and doing the tagging and coming up with the API integration, you kind of got to keep that all in sync, which was something we had to pay a lot of attention to. And then after doing all that, so you can see like 90% of the work was actually before we even touched the code. So the actual technical integration was pretty easy. It didn't take us long, and one of our engineers is here. He can throw something at me, perhaps, if that's not true. But relatively speaking, considering all the other things that are going on in the project, the Newton technical part of it was not the biggest piece. It was more kind of understanding how the content's going to fit into the way they think about the world. Okay, so what are some of the takeaways? If I were giving myself advice a while ago, having gone through it once, you know, what would I want to know at this point going into the project? So we talked about like the content and cutting it up. So I think you have to take a hard look at the modular versus linear nature of your content. And we you know, broke out Excel spreadsheets to say, okay, if we do it right, you know, we're going to rewrite 90% of it, and we have to pay writers and artists and UX people to kind of get that done. Or we can do it kind of not right and reuse it and save ourselves money. So that was a major exercise, and I'd highly suggest you do that before you decide to do adaptive, because that has a huge impact on whether or not it's going to make sense for your project. Because if you have a linear model and you can't get the funds to go redo that content, then adaptive might not be as useful as you might think. The content and the exercises we went through, the costs, in terms of a lot of the content that we use with our clients, you can get leverage from existing libraries, and I think there are repositories out there that are really starting to kind of address the problem of kind of a modular, kind of a competence-based proficiency, and I would definitely look into third-party providers for that content before you kind of redid your entire content base. Another takeaway was the complexity, and so just some color on that. Obviously, the more complex your graph, the more benefit you're going to get out of adaptive. There's just more value add and intelligence being added. But one of the things that kind of stumped us in the beginning was we talked about chopping up the content, but they're using statistical modeling to kind of get an understanding of your learner. That doesn't mean that you just take your content and break it up. You have to have statistically significant depth of your content. So one of the things that we didn't appreciate going into the project was the fact it wasn't, if I want to learn how to do discounted cash flow analysis and I know what an IRR is, it's not sufficient for me to go take the paragraph on IRR out of the book or the PDF, and that's the content, and then I'm going to ask a question from my book and put it into the assessment, because that's not enough data for the algorithm to understand how well you've learned this. So take all that I said about breaking up your content into modular and then mapping it and putting in tagging and dependencies and all that, and multiply it by 25. So, and we didn't get there, right? Like, it was cost prohibitive for us to create enough content to kind of hit the high end of the statistical significance. So, we hit it in the middle somewhere. And the idea is we'll get it off the ground, it'll add some value, and then we'll add content over time. But that kind of threw us for a loop in the beginning because we weren't thinking of it that way, that statistics were at work. Who knew? So then, and that went for the assessments too. We started with the strategy of we're going to take questions, because keep in mind they already have these questions sitting in a bank somewhere. We would take the questions and we would switch up some of the text, or we would change the variables in some of the questions, and that didn't work. It's just we tried to shortcut it, and to a certain extent it did. Like, there's some straightforward assessments where it wasn't a problem, but a lot of time was spent in creating that statistical depth in the assessments, because you get basically assessment exhaustion very quickly. So I get it wrong, and every time I get it wrong, the algorithm wants to hit me with a different type of assessment, because if you just shoot the same assessment back at somebody again and again, it doesn't learn as much about you as if it can throw different kinds of assessments at you that have different characteristics, whether it's visual or numeric or interactive or something like that. The more diverse the assessment set is, the more intelligence you can pass back to the adaptive learning algorithm. And then cost, I think I covered. Basically, it was that times everything by 25, which was an interesting conversation with our client. So then another takeaway is on the logical mapping. We had the benefit of, we were basically ripping OpenEdX apart. That's something that we do. So we were ripping off the UI and still using the database, still using Studio, but we're in the weeds in the code, and that mapping between our client's content, the edX platform, and the adaptive learning engine, that would have been really hard if we didn't do that, because edX has kind of a certain way of thinking about the world, and we had to mess with the tree structure of the courses. There are actually concepts that were outside of edX completely, so it really required us to kind of open the thing up to make that mapping work. It wasn't just us sitting in front of a PowerPoint and mapping like, oh, Newton calls it this thing and edX calls it this thing and we call it that. It was more involved than that. It was actually opening up the code to make it work, and that again costs money to do that. Another quirk of it was, which we didn't fully appreciate going in, was that since it's statistical learning algorithm, it actually takes time to build that understanding. So, and the exactness with which it learns about a learner is not clear. It varies because it's math, and math is confusing. So we had this experience where the learners would be answering questions, and there's a score in the corner kind of showing them their progress, as you'd expect, kind of taking an exam. And it wasn't moving. So the conceptual model that we were presenting to our learners was at odds with this, hey, we're going to kind of gamify it a little bit and give you some feedback on your score to make engagement. but at the same time, the engine behind the scenes hasn't figured it out yet. So we had to kind of balance those two things. I think we came up with a decent solution, but that's something to keep in mind from a learner experience standpoint. So if I were doing this again, would I use adaptive? If I had to make this decision for the next project, the modular content, that would be my #1 question. So I need to get statistically significant depth across my content, and it has to be modular. If that's going to be cost prohibitive or impossible for you to do, I'm not sure. Then the complex pathing, I mean, it's kind of obvious. If your content is linear, you're not going to get any benefit from an algorithm. So do I have this sort of data? And you think about like adaptive, I think, has gotten a lot of traction in kind of the core STEM. Sorry, forgot to turn that. Like think about like math. If you did algebra, there's a massive number or depth in history and assessments around algebra. Obviously, opera, not so much. So where on the spectrum does your content sit in terms of there's a depth of existing content and there's binary answers to that content? So qualitative questions or qualitative learning, not as applicable. And then there's the data intelligence scale. And I don't think this is something that you would say, okay, if it's not there, you wouldn't use adaptive. I think it's a net add for adaptive learning. It really gives you this opportunity to kind of, it really gives you this opportunity to kind of look at your learners individually, kind of really thoroughly understand how they get through the learning process. But then also it helps heads of online education kind of step back and kind of assess the program as a whole in terms of multi-dimensional. The depth of the content, am I asking the right questions? Is there a theme around how people are learning in the best way? Think multimedia and that sort of thing. So that's it. Yeah.
Are there any generic category of learner that will ease the process? Suppose you decide that there are 5 generic category of learner and you made 5 different versions of a model depending on the 5 category of learner, and you let the system present one or the other depending on generic category the things that the learner is on.
Mm-hmm. So I think your question was, would it be helpful to categorize the learners and kind of use that as part of the model? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So you probably best people to talk about this would be the adaptive learning folks, because they're really driving kind of the intelligence and the recommendations that come back from the model. I think that it just practically speaking, it depends on how large your learner base is. I think you can go down a rabbit's hole in trying to take all that data and come up with statistically significant conclusions around what sort of content and what sort of assessment is the best for users. So sure, yeah, grouping it seems like a logical way of thinking about it. Maybe we'll try it. Yeah.
Is there a way to test that your adaptive things works or not? Because I can really wait for years to see that if things work or not.
Yeah, I think because we talked about that on this project, and there's no absolute platonic score or measurement in terms of learning. So what we've really focused on is relative to the population, and what do the outliers look like, and then also the population, how quickly is it moving through the process. So the amount of time spent learning, the overall time between start and finish, and then the proficiency scores, all those things should be moving over time. And granted, it's a complex problem because the software could suck and the UI stinks, and that's the reason it's not the adaptive model. But that's how we would kind of think of it.
trouble getting the content experts to agree on what the knowledge map was?
I think the answer is yes. We in that it wasn't because there were butting heads. This was new territory, and there were differences in terms of things we want to try. So when you say, okay, we're gonna do something from scratch, from the ground up, you get a lot of opinions on how that should go. But at the end of the day, it was corporate learning. So there was, people yelling about time frames and costs and budget. So eventually we got there. Yeah.
Would you expect, say, people who own content to be able to sort of answer some of those great questions you had, like is it linear, is it modular, or is that something that you almost have to go through the process of trying to do an adaptive model to be able to answer?
Yeah, I think the right answer is it varies. Some folks have given a lot of thought, and I think knowledge graphs is a more common thing being talked about these days. But there are lots of folks who, lots of faculty, lots of that just really like that linear model. They've been doing it for years. It works. Stop bugging me. So I think it's a combination of getting those folks to understand just what it is and why you might want to do it, and then educating them on kind of the benefits that they might get out of it. Yeah. Yeah, the only thing, so the answer is we're pretty much completely reliant on the Newton algorithm. The only exception is if we need to step back into a linear mode, because there might not be adaptive content for a particular topic, we can do that. Yeah.
Do you use any specific instructional design frameworks, and if so, which ones?
Do we use any Largely that was driven by the client, so we didn't really do that. They've 20 plus years of doing this, so they had their own model and their own way of kind of thinking about bringing it online. Yeah.
You mentioned about the binary constraint of the assessment to work in the team framework.
Yes.
What happens if an answer gets scored on 0 to 5 point scale in open response format?
Sorry, what was the last bit?
Open response format, qualitative assessment.
I'm sorry. What's the question?
So you mentioned that you need to have binary assessment in order to have the adaptive framework work.
Yep.
What happens if the assessment is more modular, like 0 to 5 point scale, or an open response answer assessment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways you could do that. You could go bug Newton and ask them to adjust their model. The other way would be to kind of have some interim model. We have another project where we're doing teacher certification online, and that's a very qualitative model. And we can still use that. This is the last question, by the way. I just got to stop that. So we can still use that model, but it requires the qualitative assessment then gets translated into a quantitative assessment that actually goes into the system. So there's this interim step. Sorry, she said stop, or else I would answer your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're out of time for this session, but we do have a break, so I don't know if Edward is happy to take your questions up here, but just another round of applause for Edward. Thank you so much.